Well, welcome aboard the Silver Spirit. I'm pleased to be with you here as your destination speaker to tell you about the places we're going to go. I provide a little bit of historical background and general information, and my talks are on this channel under the enrichment channel. And every other day I give a presentation, and I'm happy to see you here live. I'm a sea captain. I've been working on ships most of my life. I have a U.S. Coast Guard license, and I've worked on tall ships and tugboats and icebreakers and all kinds of things. But I'm happy to be here aboard this beautiful ship with you for our voyage through the Baltic Sea. And today I'm going to talk about Bornholm, Denmark, and Gdansk, Poland. These are our first stops after we sailed out of Copenhagen. And it's a beautiful time of year. It's so summery that we can't imagine soon it'll be cold and dark and wet here, but we're enjoying it while we can. First, to just show you where we are. We've sailed out of Copenhagen, which is on the island of Zealand, as in Old Zealand, not New Zealand, on the east coast of Denmark. And we're going from here to a little island which is closer to Sweden and to Germany than it is to the other parts of Denmark. And this is one of the ends of Denmark. It's mostly a resort island, agricultural, as is many of the countryside of Denmark. But it's a bit removed from the rest of Denmark and has always had a bit of an independent streak to it. It became Danish because in earlier times, this part of Sweden was part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and then in various political rearrangements, southern Sweden became part of Sweden rather than Denmark. But Bornholm, this island in the center of the entrance to the Baltic Sea, became Danish and has stayed proudly Danish to this point. So here's just a view of Rønne, where we will be docking. And this is an island with a small population, maybe 10, 15,000 through the year, but it gets 100,000 visitors a month because it is a pleasant island away from the cities and the busier parts of Denmark and Sweden and Germany. It's been called the Bermuda of the Baltic, which is true in the summer but not in the winter. And it has a sort of an independent streak to the point where it has its own flag. That's the Danish flag with a green cross in it, symbolizing the lush vegetation and also their efforts to become the first island part of Denmark that will have no internal combustion or petroleum products, but become the first green island and have all electrical services. So we'll see a bit of that when we're there. This island is a granite outcropping from the sea, but it was scraped over by glaciers during the Ice Age. And so this sort of view of the landmass of it shows you how the ice came and scraped the land and left some dramatic cliffs, mostly beaches, but here and there some sedimentary rock. And this led to an industry of cutting out blocks for ballast for ships and also building materials that would be put on ships and sent to the rest of Denmark or Sweden for construction. Nowadays it looks like a patchwork of farmland, mostly some woodland and some preserves up in the highlands, just so they have a water supply and a clean environment. But the main port where we're going is Rønne, which is a pretty big place. It has ferry service daily to Copenhagen and Germany and Sweden. So in the days of modern transport, it is a busy place. But back in earlier centuries, it was a remote and very poor place. And the people lived by fishing mostly and farming. But they were considered the few and unfortunate had to live in the middle of the sea, where they were victims of pirates and competing Viking chieftains, and then other wars followed. But nowadays it's a very peaceful place, which most people go just to have a quiet beach resort and enjoy the fresh air and be away from the noisier cities and land nearby. So here you see a windsurfer. And as typical in Denmark, you see a lot of windmills. Denmark is the leading country with a great company called Ottosson, which produces the world's biggest windmills, and they're all over Denmark, and Bornholm is building more as the transformation of the economy goes to electrical power. But when you go up into the countryside, you see fields of wheat and dairy farms. There's occasional lakes and small forests. It's not a very big island, so this is the exception to the shores all around it. But you do have a few of these Danish-speaking cows, and milk and cheese products are typical. Well, this island was settled in prehistory by people somehow were on boats and were coming here, and some early monuments are to the Norse heritage. The Vikings were here. They considered this a strategic trading post because they could either trade with other land nearby or else protect their own land by holding Bornholm. And it's been a strategic place to the point when in the 1500s, the Swedish Bishop of Lund built a castle to protect the place. Now it's just ruins now, but that's the biggest medieval construction on the island up on a hill overlooking the harbor of Ronna. They also have these unique round churches, which are in a few other parts of Denmark, but this is the best examples from the medieval time. That's from about 1200 to 1500. They built a series of them, and some of the excursions will go see them. These are very curious because they're actually a fortress church, and you can see up around the roof there are openings so archers or later muskets could defend the churches from the raiders that would come from the sea. Well, this is a unique place because the churches are very important. Every town has one, along with a lighthouse. And this, again, is in Ronna. When we get off the ship and you take a shuttle into town, you see it's a busy place because this is the harbor where many people come with their holiday baskets, and they rent houses, and so the whole island fills up in the summer. And they have typically Danish sort of countryside houses all through. There's a few modern hotels, but this is actually a very low level town, and then there are many small villages and other ports around the small island. But you can walk around. It's very pleasant and easy to get around. Here's a fellow who's sitting on a bench at a place where I think they have dance parties. It says Dans Paw. It says, let's dance about it. Well, there are other buildings in the harbor. This is a little ship's museum and the town hall of Ronna. So this is a small part of Denmark, but proudly Danish. But again, they have their own flag as a separate identity from the rest of Denmark. You'll see, this is the old post office. And the other thing you'll see when you go around town is a lot of people have little scooters, electric scooters. And this is the policy of Denmark as a nation, but particularly Bornholm, I think if they get enough wind power, solar power, alternative fuels perhaps, they can actually have all electric cars and keep the clean air and the quiet of the countryside villages. Here's one that scooted by us when we were there the other week. They're not exactly off-road, but they're pretty handy and easy to park. There's a church called St. Nicholas right off the harbor, which is a walking distance from the shuttle, and this is a medieval church, not a round church, but a very square, strong building, and had been surrounded with a city wall in medieval times. But it's a beautiful church. If you happen to be there and have the time to go in, if not on a tour, you can just go in. It's open, this beautiful interior, sort of late medieval, early Gothic with a tremendous church organ, and then some of the remains of the very medieval time when the Vikings and the Norse people finally converted to Christianity, and they painted, here's a picture of Christ looking sort of like a Viking, I guess, with some of the old floral designs that are typical of Norse iconography going back into prehistoric times. On the altar of this church, you have this painting, and this is unusual because you see there's no cross, but there is a painting of people out in a storm at sea. And so this, like many Danish towns, was a port, and they would pray to the safety of the sailors. This has old Danish saying, "Save us, Lord, from the troubles of the sea." And above the pews in this beautiful church, there's a very large ship model. And again, this is to pray for people who go to work at sea and may or may not come back. So that's the life of the old seaport. You had no communication, so people would go out and you would never know about them until they came back, or maybe a letter in a bottle would show up. But this is the old harbor wall with somebody waiting for their ship to come in. And this is the harbor now. The old bits of the harbor have been replaced by modern construction, and they're building more and more. Those are grain silos and landfills, so they're trying to make a safer harbor for the bigger ships, particularly the big ferry boats come in. But right where we dock, you can see the most tremendous construction of the new generation of windmills. Now those are the blades, which have to be, see the size of the cars and the trucks there. Those are as big as any I've ever seen. And they'll be mounted by a big crane out offshore, and that's going to power this whole island, so that they've made a proposal that once these are operational, there'll be plenty of electricity, even they'll send it over to other parts of the region. But everybody on the island will get a free electric vehicle, whatever they like, bicycle or car or a little mini cart. So they will eventually eliminate all gasoline and petrol and oil production or consumption on the island. So that's a beautiful view there as we go back out to sea. And then we're going to be heading out and south and east to Poland. Now this is the Baltic Sea. It is a kind of a odd looking ocean just because there's sea, because it originally was all a lake, and it was deep forests in the wilderness back 10,000 more years ago. And when the ice age ended and the ice retreated, it left this low valley that was full of forest and wildlife and such. But as the seas rose, they broke through the islands that are Denmark now, and then the whole lake filled up with salt water. And this makes it a very unusual sea, because it's about 1/10 as the salt content as the ocean in the North Sea, because there are many rivers and drainage of this landmass that come into the Baltic. But the whole sea is no more than 100 meters, about 300 feet deep, so it's a very shallow sea. And it borders all these different countries that we know. We're becoming Denmark, Poland, Germany, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Sweden. So they share this sea together, but they're very close neighbors, and there's a lot of shipping in transit, and they are, for all these centuries, have lived off of the sea. Unfortunately, most of the fishing has declined dramatically because of agricultural fertilizers, chemical pollution, and so it's considered one of the let's say victims of modernization, that the fishing industry that was so important here is almost completely out of fish at this point. And they're trying to fix some of this, but it's a problem here more than any other part of the world. They call this the poisoned sea in oceanography. But anyway, it's still beautiful on the surface, if not for the fish. But we're then going to Gdansk, which is the seaport of Poland. Now, Poland's a fairly large piece of nation on the north coast of Europe, on the Baltic coast, I should say, because it doesn't extend out, does not have an Atlantic port. But Gdansk was historically the port into the inland and up the rivers and into Central Europe. So a lot of it has a very sandy beach. Many people are sort of surprised that this part of the northern Europe would be so sandy as to have dunes and vast areas with beaches. Denmark has some too, but Gdansk is on the Vistula River Lagoon, which is a saltwater entrance to the larger Baltic Sea, and the city is on that shore. We are going to land at the port of Gdynia, which is just outside of the main city of Gdansk. But if you look on the right side, you see in Russian it says Kaliningrad. That is a leftover from World War II, where the Russians occupied this part of Poland, and they have a major navy and military base there, but it's isolated from the rest of Russia. So this is one of the problems of politics, is that cuts one piece of land off, gives it to somebody else, and thereby becomes an issue for ongoing generations. Well, I'm going to just show you the city. which is on the banks of the Vistula River, and it sort of spreads out with suburbs and factories. But the heart of it is a medieval city, trading city, which has been damaged over the centuries but rebuilt pretty much. But it's a very elegant and beautiful city with these beautiful houses that are vertical. Some of them were offices and warehouses, but these are residences. So it was a very wealthy city for many years just because it was right on the Baltic Sea for trading. In the very far past, medieval times, 814, this illustration is of how many different kingdoms and borders changed, and Poland in particular has been fought over and traded back and forth and invaded because it's on a flat plains, and so time after time there have been invaders and warfare, which I'll just give you an examples of. The Attila the Hun attacked Krakow in 1241, and Poland was traded between Russia and Germany, Sweden, many times. So this has created a sense of, let's say, resentment to the neighbors, which goes on to this day that Poland now is independent, but often it wasn't. But they look back to their medieval and recent past when they were independent, strong, and could hold their own against their neighbors who were not necessarily friendly. So this is King Casimir the Great, 1333. He was born, and he was sort of the founder of the modern kingdom of Poland. He put his own mug on a coin like this, but he had a famous queen who was actually the daughter of his nephew, who was crowned queen at age 11, married at 14, had more children, and then created a union with other Baltic states, particularly Lithuania. And so she was also another leader in the early years of modern times. But most important, Gdansk, which in German is called Danzig, was part of the Germanic trading league that went from city to city, not necessarily the whole country, from the ports from Russia to Latvia, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Hamburg, Brugge in Belgium, and even London. So this was the trading pact, sort of like an early version of the European Union. It was not a military pact, but they would patrol to keep the pirates away and to guard their cities, which are often walled and armed, and allow these kind of big trading vessels to go back and forth. So typically they would bring in foodstuffs or else fur, timber, amber, and other precious things from other ports, and this built the wealth of these cities. And also the Polish people were led by very strong and determined kings, including this King John Sobieski in the 1640s and 70s, who famously went to the aid of Vienna at the battle when they were being invaded by the Ottoman Turks. And by the Knights of Poland, they saved Vienna from becoming a Muslim capital. Now, this is old history, but it seems still going on somewhat. The conflicts of today are often an echo of battles and disputes in the past. So Gdansk has a big fort just off the harbor called the Malbork Castle, which is the largest brick castle in the world. And then it has canalways and landings for the old ships and a modern port where we will dock. But they have some houses in the back alleys that go back 1,000 or more years. And elegant buildings of the Hanseatic era when it was a prosperous city. And it was most famous because it had artisans that worked in amber. Now the Baltic Sea, because it had been a pine forest that got flooded by ocean water, it actually preserved a lot of the trees which over time decayed, but they left their sap or their pitch, and that hardened into amber, and this washes up on the shores. I had a Polish friend said that after every storm, the kids would go out to the beach and pick up chunks of amber, which then they would make into things or sell. Most famously made here was the amber room, a whole room of decoration that was given to the Tsar of Russia. But even here on the ship, you can see some precious pieces of amber, which is a very unique looking orange and glowing jewel. and other houses and other places are very elegantly made and often rebuilt after all of the destruction of the centuries. So nowadays it's very peaceful and very beautiful. A lot of things have been restored. The central cathedral and main buildings are in beautiful condition now. The plazas are full of people and shops, and these typical Hanseatic high-rise houses, they have no elevators, so if you're going to be going in one, there's a lot of stairs in this town, but it's beautiful architecture, mainly to have the great ornamental front of each building and plazas where you can walk around and enjoy the public pedestrian areas. Well, it was not always so easy in Gdansk and Poland, because Poland through the century has been the victim of invaders from the east and the west and the south and the north. So every so often it disappeared off the map as part of Germany or Russia. Particularly the Russian Revolution and pogroms created a lot of refugees. And here's an office in Gdansk that was booking tickets on the Red Star line to America for many of the refugees of war, particularly Jewish refugees that would come out of Poland and have gone around the world. But most famously, the Russians and the Germans in 1939 decided they would just chop up the country and each take half of it. So when World War II started, it was in Gdansk, or Danzig to the Germans. And the German Navy came in and bombarded the fortresses and sank the Polish Navy right there. And then they marched in and took over the city. And then the Poles responded by their army, and they also had cavalry and knights of old, but they were no match for the German army, which came in with the Luftwaffe and the tanks and the Blitzkrieg, and so it took over Poland pretty quickly. And that was the first great aggression of World War II in cooperation with the Russians. Of course, it went on and the Germans invaded Russia, and the whole thing didn't work out too well in the end. But it meant that Poland was basically chopped up, and they had no independence until later under the Soviet Union. They were granted nominal status, but for the 1940s, it was all under the stormtroopers from Germany, and they burned down and destroyed much of the city when there was resistance. And then they declared, oh, this is free. And this German stamp says, Danzig is Deutsch, Danzig Gdansk is German. And the stamp says, thanks to the liberator Adolf Hitler. Well, they moved in and they made this, again, sort of a more German and a Nazi city. And then they did their final solution. They destroyed the synagogue. Tens of thousands of Jews were sent off to concentration camps and murdered. So this is the tragedy of our recent century. And then when the Soviet army came and took it all over, they made maps with everything in Russian, including the remaining part of Poland, which is now called Kaliningrad, as part of Russia. And it became a communist state, socialist state. Here's a concert pianist playing Chopin, the great Polish composer, to the dock workers, shipyard workers in Gdansk. Well, this is history that comes back to, let's say, follow up and change things, so that when the Solidarity Union in the shipyard went on strike against the communist government, this created a movement called Solidarity, which those that are old enough might remember in 1989. They finally made an agreement they would stop their political strike if they would liberalize the country and become a democracy. And so in a remarkable turn of events, this General Walensky and Lech Walesa agreed they would reform the country, and they had a peaceful evolution to this day. So the great hero of our modern time in Poland is Lech Walesa, the great labor leader, who declined to become president, but he was instrumental in transforming Poland into the peaceful and prosperous nation it is now. So when our ship comes in, we're going to come up the channel to Gdynia as a port and a side river from the main city, because the ships are too big to go in there. But you note as we come in this narrow channel, there's this monument up on the hill, which is the war monument to the resistance at the time. So this is very fresh memory. And you can walk from the ship up and see the, let's say, unsubtle monument of to the heroes of the resistance in World War II. a lot of Gdansk was bombed and burned, and so coming here is a remarkable thing because you can feel the wounds of the past, but also the reconstruction. So here's a center of medieval Gdansk, and on the river you can take excursion boats or just walk around the canals. And this is the modern flags of the city of Gdansk. The one on the left is the city flag, the Polish flag, and the European Union. And as you go into the town, you'll see that these canals and docks are still there. That's an old tramp ship that was a training vessel, which is now a museum ship on one side. There was an entrance to the medieval quarter, which has been rebuilt and has a gate into the older parts of town. But some of these fortifications for the central Gdansk are still there, but you can see the brickwork everywhere where they had to repair the damage and rebuild their town. And when my grandson Pemba and I were out on a little excursion boat, we came by this rather elaborate, let's say, reproduction pirate ship, but it's so elaborate you'd think it would never actually go anywhere, but it actually does go sailing around the harbor occasionally. And here's a curious front of the ship with the somebody pouring something into a big shell. So it's sort of the ultimate pirate ship of the city, I guess. But it's mostly a fun place. You have carousels and shops and cafes, and you have a rebuilt center. And this is remarkable because a lot of this was just smoky rubble ruin. Some of the houses were saved, but they decided they'd build it back the way it used to be, except maybe it's all glass and maybe it's a different style. So it's a very architecturally very curious. A lot of the big old buildings have been turned into museums, hotels. This tower that I showed just ago is now a spook museum, a kind of what do they call that? A horror exhibit of ghouls and vampires and stuff like that, just like in the good old days. But the most famous building is this warehouse, the old warehouse, they call it in Polish, and it sits right there at the junction of the rivers and has a tower that used to have a crane, and so they could load all of the ships there and put all the goods in the other storehouses around there. And this, again, is the symbol of the city and its revival. We actually took that little, looks like a little sports car, but it's a little motorboat, and so you can rent that for an hour and go puttering around on your own or go on another excursion. I'm sure the ship has that arranged if you want to go on a ship's arrangement. But again, if you look at these buildings, the remnants of what was the destroyed part has been added onto and rebuilt up. So it sort of looks like the old time, but it has very much the memory of the destruction of the city. And some places they just built something new that looks like it fits in. And on the river, you can even go stay in a hotel room, the floating hotels they call this. So they line the places. So if you don't mind everybody looking in your window, you can live on the river. So this is a story of a city that has revived itself, and the nation is now, let's say, independent and part of the EU and NATO, and they're still rebuilding some of the old parts of town. But we saw this as we were coming in. Some of the old buildings they have yet to rebuild, and on the lower left side you see the invaders from another planet. Maybe that's what's going on. But the real worry here is the trouble in Ukraine, because they are very close to the Belarus-Russian border and the Ukrainian border. So Poland has been a major ally in NATO to help the Ukrainians against the Russian invasion, because they could be next as they had been before. And so I'll talk about this more with the other Baltic countries as we go to Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. But there is an area in Poland and Kaliningrad that's in red here, which is very much feeling like that could be the gate into invading Poland again, although it seems unlikely and it seems all madness to everybody who follows the news. So the Baltic leaders and NATO and others with the Ukrainians have tried to resist having a greater war and to keep the independence of these countries. So you can imagine the people in Poland and Gdansk and who have knowledge of their history and worry about it repeating itself while they're going about a modern life with modern conveniences and such, and a lot of new building and universities and entertainment. And they think, oh, this is normal. Well, it often has been for some time, but they hope that the troubles of the past will not visit them again. But there's a certain anxiety which is expressed in this. The curvy building, they call this, in a suburb of Gdansk. And so you can almost feel the tension in the air about, is this going to last, or are we going to be for more trouble? But meanwhile, we can enjoy Gdansk, and as this poster on the street said, take a chance, see it for yourself, and enjoy this great city and this interesting country while we have our brief visit here. And that's a statue of Poseidon that's in the main square near the city hall, representing their interest in the ocean and the larger world as part of a larger community of Europe and the world. And so as we go on, I'll talk more about the other countries and ports as we get all our way to Helsinki and Stockholm. But I'll leave you with a couple of quotes just about our trip on the ocean to visit places, which is a great joy for us to be able to go and travel like this. But I'll give you a quote from Helene Belek, who said, "The sea drives truth into a man like salt." And from George Herbert, he said, "He that would learn to pray, let him go to sea." And John F. Kennedy said, "We are all tied to the ocean. And when we go back to the sea to sail or just to watch, we go back to where we came from." And with that, I wish you a bon voyage, and I look forward to meeting you, and have a great trip aboard the Silver Spirit. Thank you very much.